Check page 47, Marcus whispered, his weathered hands trembling as he leaned close to the mahogany conference table. The words cut through the sterile air of the 32nd floor boardroom like a prayer spoken in desperation. His janitor's uniform, faded blue with years of honest work, seemed to absorb every fluorescent light in the room. The CEO's Mont Blanc pen froze mid-signature, the $4 billion merger document suddenly feeling like it weighed 1,000 pounds. Around the table, executives in $1,000 suits turned their heads toward the man who cleaned their offices every night, their expressions shifting from annoyance to confusion. Marcus stepped back, his heart pounding against his ribs like a trapped bird, knowing he had just crossed a line that could cost him everything. The silence stretched between them, heavy with the weight of secrets and the promise of destruction. The morning had started like any other Tuesday in downtown Chicago, with Marcus Williams arriving at Meridian Financial Tower at 4:30 a.m., his beat-up Honda Civic sputtering to life in the employee parking garage. His work boots echoed against the concrete as he made his way to the service elevator, the same path he'd walked for the past 8 years. If you've ever felt invisible in a world that doesn't see your worth, share with me in the comments where you're watching from, because this story is about finding your voice when it matters most. The tower stretched 45 floors into the cloudy Illinois sky, each floor representing dreams and ambitions that Marcus could only observe from the shadows. He'd learned to move quietly through the halls of corporate power, his presence acknowledged only by the gleaming surfaces he left behind. But today, something was different in the weight of his steps, in the way his dark eyes seemed to carry a burden heavier than the industrial vacuum he pushed down the marble corridors. Marcus had been a single father for 6 years now, ever since Sarah lost her battle with breast cancer, leaving him to raise their daughter Emma alone. At 42, his once broad shoulders carried the weight of 2 jobs, and endless worry lines etched deep around his brown eyes. His calloused hands told the story of a man who had worked construction, painted houses, and finally found steady employment in the sterile world of high finance, cleaning up after people who earned more in a day than he made in a year. Emma, now 14, was his entire universe, a brilliant girl with her mother's gentle smile and a mind sharp enough to make sense of calculus homework that left Marcus scratching his head. Every night after his shift, he'd help her with schoolwork at their small kitchen table in their South Side apartment, the sound of sirens and city life humming through thin walls. She dreamed of studying engineering at Northwestern, a goal that seemed as distant as the stars, but burned just as brightly in both their hearts. The medical bills from Sarah's treatment still arrived like monthly reminders of loss, even though she'd been gone for years. The Meridian Financial Tower had become more than just his workplace. It was his observatory into a world of power and money that operated by rules he was never taught. He knew the building better than most executives knew their own offices. Every shortcut, every hidden camera, every conversation that echoed through ventilation systems. Marcus had developed the ability to become invisible while being everywhere, his quiet presence allowing him to witness the raw truth behind polished corporate facades. He'd seen deals made and broken, careers destroyed over lunch meetings, and fortunes shifted with casual phone calls. The executives barely noticed him as he emptied their wastebaskets and dusted their awards, their conversations flowing around him like he was just another piece of furniture. But Marcus listened, not out of malice, but because understanding the currents of power had become essential to his survival in their world. His intelligence, hidden beneath his humble uniform, had been shaped by necessity and sharpened by the desire to protect his daughter's future. 3 weeks ago, while cleaning the office of Senior Vice President Richard Caldwell, Marcus had noticed something that made his blood run cold. Papers scattered across Caldwell's desk revealed details about the upcoming merger with Pacific Investment Group, but the numbers didn't add up the way they should have. His years of helping Emma with advanced math had taught him to spot patterns and inconsistencies that others might miss. The environmental impact report seemed deliberately falsified, hiding toxic contamination that would eventually surface and destroy not just Pacific Investment Group, but potentially Meridian Financial as well. Page 47 of the environmental assessment contained the real data that painted a picture of ecological disaster worth billions in cleanup costs and legal settlements. Caldwell's phone conversations, overheard during late-night cleaning sessions, confirmed what the documents suggested. They knew about the contamination and were planning to complete the merger before anyone discovered the truth. The weight of this knowledge had been eating at Marcus for weeks, keeping him awake as he stared at the ceiling of his small bedroom. Every night since his discovery, Marcus had wrestled with an impossible decision that could change everything or destroy him completely. His daughter's future hung in the balance. College tuition, their modest but stable life, the health insurance that kept them afloat. Speaking up could mean losing his job, his reputation, and possibly facing legal retaliation from some of the most powerful lawyers money could buy. But staying silent meant watching thousands of innocent investors lose their life savings, while environmental disaster poisoned communities across 3 states. Sarah's voice seemed to whisper to him in the darkness, reminding him of the values they'd tried to instill in Emma: integrity, courage, and the responsibility to stand up for what's right, even when it costs everything. The merger meeting had been scheduled for this Tuesday morning, and Marcus knew it would be his last chance to prevent a catastrophe that would ripple through families like his own. His hands shook as he prepared his uniform that morning, knowing he was about to step out of the shadows and into a spotlight that might blind him forever. The boardroom on the 32nd floor buzzed with the energy of men and women who believed they were about to reshape the financial landscape of America. CEO Jonathan Meridian, a silver-haired man in his early 60s, commanded the room with the easy confidence of someone born into wealth and power. Around the polished conference table sat the board of directors, their collective net worth exceeding the GDP of small nations, each one eager to see their quarterly bonuses swell with the success of this merger. Pacific Investment Group's representatives had flown in from California, their sun-tanned faces and expensive suits a stark contrast to the Chicago natives' more conservative appearance. The legal teams flanked both sides like armies preparing for battle, their briefcases filled with documents that would bind 2 corporate giants together in what the financial press had dubbed the deal of the decade. Coffee cups clinked against saucers as assistants scurried around the edges of the room, ensuring every detail was perfect for this historic moment. The morning sun streaming through floor-to-ceiling windows cast long shadows across documents that would soon bear signatures worth billions of dollars. Marcus had timed his arrival perfectly, knowing that the executives would be too focused on their merger to pay attention to the maintenance staff. His heart hammered against his chest as he pushed his cleaning cart into the boardroom, the wheels squeaking slightly on the marble floor. The familiar weight of spray bottles and microfiber cloths felt different today, like props in a play where he was about to break character and reveal himself as more than just the invisible man who emptied their trash. Jonathan Meridian barely glanced up as Marcus began his routine, wiping down surfaces and straightening chairs with the practiced efficiency of years of service. The conversation continued around him, legal jargon and financial projections creating a symphony of greed that made his stomach turn. He could see page 47 of the environmental report sitting in Caldwell's folder, the damning evidence hidden beneath layers of bureaucratic language and corporate doublespeak. Every second that passed brought them closer to signing away the future of thousands of families who trusted Meridian Financial with their dreams. The pen in Jonathan Meridian's hand moved steadily across preliminary documents, each signature bringing them closer to a disaster that only Marcus seemed to understand. The moment arrived like a cliff edge appearing through morning fog, sudden and terrifying in its finality. Jonathan Meridian reached for the final merger document, the one that would legally bind both companies together and trigger the environmental catastrophe that Marcus had discovered weeks ago. Around the table, executives leaned forward in anticipation, their eyes gleaming with the promise of enormous profits and market dominance. The Pacific Investment Group representatives smiled with satisfaction, unaware that they were about to inherit a toxic legacy that would destroy their company within 2 years. Marcus felt time slow down as he watched the CEO's hand hover over the signature line, the Mont Blanc pen catching the morning light like a weapon poised to strike. His daughter's face flashed through his mind, Emma at 14, brilliant and hopeful, trusting that her father would always find a way to protect her and their future together. The weight of his janitor's uniform suddenly felt like armor as he realized that sometimes the most important battles are fought not by generals and politicians, but by ordinary people who choose to speak truth to power. His voice, when it came, was quiet, but carried the strength of absolute conviction born from love and desperation. "Check page 47, he whispered again, this time louder, his words cutting through the corporate chatter like a blade through silk. Every head in the room turned toward him, confusion and irritation painting their faces as they tried to process why their janitor was interrupting the most important business meeting of their careers. Marcus stood straighter, his shoulders squaring as he met Jonathan Meridian's piercing blue eyes without flinching, knowing that everything he'd worked for was now balanced on the edge of a knife. The environmental report seemed to pulse with malevolent energy from its place in Caldwell's folder, page 47, containing enough truth to topple empires and destroy lives. Caldwell's face had gone pale, his hand instinctively moving to protect the folder, as if Marcus's words had physically struck him across the face. The lawyers exchanged glances, their trained minds already calculating the implications of whatever secret the maintenance man had stumbled upon during his nightly rounds. Marcus could feel his future hanging in the balance, suspended between the comfortable invisibility of his old life and the terrifying uncertainty of speaking truth to the most powerful people in the city. The silence that followed stretched like a taut wire ready to snap, filled with the electric tension of a moment that would define not just Marcus's life, but the fate of thousands of investors and countless families across America. Jonathan Meridian's pen remained frozen above the signature line, his business instincts warring with his desire to dismiss this interruption and complete the deal that would cement his legacy as one of the greatest CEOs in corporate history. Around the table, the board members shifted uncomfortably, their expensive suits suddenly feeling too tight as they sensed that something fundamental had shifted in the carefully orchestrated balance of their meeting. The Pacific Investment Group representatives looked confused and increasingly concerned, their dreams of corporate expansion beginning to crack under the weight of unknown variables. Marcus could hear his own heartbeat echoing in his ears like thunder, each pulse reminding him that he had just stepped across a line that separated the powerful from the powerless. His weathered hands, scarred from years of honest labor, trembled slightly as he waited for Jonathan Meridian to make a choice that would either validate his courage or destroy everything he'd worked to build. The morning sun continued to stream through the windows, illuminating dust motes that danced in the air like tiny witnesses to a moment that would change everything. The weight of Marcus's words settled over the boardroom like snow, quiet but transformative, covering the familiar landscape of corporate power with something entirely new and dangerous. Jonathan Meridian slowly lowered his pen, his sharp business mind beginning to process the implications of his janitor's cryptic warning, while around the table, a dozen of the most powerful people in Chicago found themselves holding their breath. The environmental report in Caldwell's folder seemed to grow heavier with each passing second, page 47 containing secrets that could either save their company or destroy it completely. Marcus stood in the center of their world, no longer invisible, his uniform a stark reminder that truth often comes from the most unexpected sources, spoken by voices that power usually chooses not to hear. The city skyline stretched endlessly beyond the windows, millions of people going about their morning routines, unaware that their financial futures hung in the balance of this single moment. Emma would be in her second period algebra class right now, probably raising her hand to answer another question that stumped her classmates, her dreams of Northwestern University burning bright and pure. Outside the conference room, the normal sounds of corporate life continued. Phones ringing, keyboards clicking, elevators humming between floors, while inside, time seemed suspended in the space between Marcus's revelation and whatever would come next. The leather chairs around the table creaked softly as executives shifted their weight, their comfortable certainties beginning to fracture under the pressure of unknown variables. Caldwell's hands had begun to sweat, leaving damp fingerprints on the folder that contained the environmental assessment, his mind racing through possible damage control scenarios while his carefully constructed facade started to crumble. The morning light streaming through the windows caught the dust particles disturbed by Marcus's cleaning cart, tiny specks floating in the air like evidence of disturbance in a world that prized order above all else. Jonathan Meridian's blue eyes remained fixed on Marcus's face, searching for signs of deception or mental instability, finding instead the steady gaze of a man who had made peace with the consequences of his choice. The merger documents lay spread across the table like fallen leaves, their legal language suddenly seeming less like protection and more like camouflage for truths that demanded to be spoken. In this moment, suspended between discovery and reckoning, Marcus Williams had transformed from invisible maintenance worker to the most powerful person in the room, holding in his weathered hands the ability to prevent a disaster that would echo across generations. The clock on the wall continued its relentless march toward 10:30 a.m., each tick marking another second closer to either catastrophe or salvation, while Marcus stood perfectly still in the eye of a storm that was about to reshape everything. His cleaning cart sat abandoned near the door, its ordinary contents, spray bottles, rags, vacuum attachments, suddenly seeming like relics from a simpler time when his biggest concern was finishing his rounds before the morning rush began. The executives around the table remained frozen in their leather chairs, caught between their desire to dismiss this interruption and their growing awareness that something fundamental had shifted in the carefully orchestrated balance of their corporate universe. Jonathan Meridian's Mont Blanc pen, worth more than Marcus made in a week, lay motionless against the merger contract, its gold surface reflecting the fluorescent lights like a small sun that had suddenly stopped burning. The environmental report in Caldwell's possession seemed to pulse with malevolent energy, page 47 containing enough explosive truth to level not just this building, but the entire financial district that stretched beyond these windows. Marcus could feel his future balancing on the edge of this moment, knowing that whatever happened next would determine not just his own fate, but the lives of thousands of families who trusted their dreams to the promises made in rooms like this. The weight of his daughter's future pressed against his chest like a physical force, reminding him why ordinary people sometimes have to do extraordinary things to protect the ones they love. Jonathan Meridian's voice, when it finally came, cut through the charged silence like a blade through silk, each word carefully measured and weighted with the authority of someone accustomed to commanding rooms full of powerful people. "Mr. Williams, isn't it?" he said, his steel-gray eyes never leaving Marcus's face as he spoke the janitor's name with surprising gentleness, as if acknowledging for the first time that the man who cleaned his offices every night was actually a human being with thoughts and feelings worthy of consideration. The use of his actual name sent a shock through Marcus's system. After 8 years of being invisible, of being addressed only as maintenance or cleaning crew, hearing his identity spoken aloud in this boardroom felt like a small miracle wrapped in growing dread. The other executives shifted uncomfortably in their leather chairs, clearly unused to their CEO engaging in conversation with someone so far below their social station, while Caldwell's face continued to drain of color as he clutched the environmental folder like a drowning man gripping a life preserver. The Pacific Investment Group representatives exchanged worried glances, their California confidence beginning to evaporate as they sensed undercurrents of deception and danger that they didn't yet understand, but could feel gathering like storm clouds on the horizon. Marcus straightened his shoulders and met Jonathan Meridian's gaze directly, drawing strength from the knowledge that truth was the most powerful weapon in any arsenal, even when wielded by someone wearing a faded janitor's uniform in a room full of $1,000 suits. The morning light streaming through the conference room windows seemed to shift and focus, as if the sun itself was leaning in to witness this moment when the invisible became visible and the powerless found their voice. "Yes, sir," Marcus replied, his voice steadier than he had expected it to be. Years of helping Emma with her homework, having taught him that confidence came from knowing you were right rather than from the clothes you wore or the title on your business card. Jonathan Meridian leaned back in his chair, his fingers steepled in front of him, as he studied Marcus with the intense focus of a man who had built an empire by reading people and situations with surgical precision. The silence stretched between them again, but this time it felt different, less hostile, more calculated, as if the CEO was running complex algorithms in his head to determine whether this unexpected interruption represented a threat to be eliminated or an opportunity to be exploited. Around the table, the other board members watched this exchange with growing fascination and concern, their initial irritation giving way to genuine curiosity about what their janitor might have discovered during his nightly rounds through their most private spaces. The lawyers were still whispering urgently among themselves, their trained minds already calculating potential exposure and liability scenarios while trying to assess the scope of whatever bombshell Marcus was about to drop on their carefully orchestrated meeting. Caldwell's breathing had become shallow and rapid, sweat beginning to stain his expensive shirt. Despite the perfectly controlled temperature of the conference room, his body betraying the panic that his face was trying desperately to conceal. The environmental folder in his hands seemed to grow heavier with each passing second. Page 47, containing enough explosive information to destroy not just this merger, but potentially the entire company that bore Jonathan Meridian's name. The CEO's next words surprised everyone in the room, including Marcus himself, revealing a complexity and intelligence that the janitor had only glimpsed during their brief encounters in the building's hallways. In my experience, Mr. Williams, when someone takes considerable personal risk to share information, it's usually because they believe something important is at stake, Jonathan Meridian said slowly, his tone carrying none of the condescension that Marcus had expected from someone in his position. The acknowledgement hit Marcus like a physical blow, validation from an unexpected source that his sacrifice might actually matter in ways he had barely dared to hope. This wasn't the response he had prepared for during his sleepless nights of worry and planning. He had expected dismissal, threats, immediate termination, not this careful consideration from a man who had every reason to protect his own interests above all else. The other executives looked shocked by their CEO's apparent willingness to engage seriously with someone they considered little more than furniture with a pulse, their comfortable assumptions about hierarchy and social order beginning to crack under the weight of this unprecedented moment. Marcus felt a flicker of something that might have been hope beginning to kindle in his chest, the possibility that speaking truth to power might actually accomplish something more than just destroying his own life and his daughter's future. The Pacific Investment Group representatives were leaning forward now, their business instincts clearly engaged, as they tried to understand what kind of information could prompt such an unusual response from someone known for his ruthless efficiency and unwavering focus on profit margins. But Jonathan Meridian's next revelation shattered Marcus's growing optimism like a hammer through glass, exposing the complex motivations and hidden agendas that drove even seemingly honorable actions in the corporate world. The truth is, Mr. Williams, we've been investigating some irregularities in our environmental assessments for several weeks now, the CEO continued, his piercing blue eyes shifting momentarily toward Caldwell before returning to Marcus's face with an intensity that made the janitor's skin crawl. The admission hung in the air like smoke from a fire that had been smoldering unseen for months, revealing layers of deception and manipulation that went deeper than Marcus had imagined possible. Caldwell's face went from pale to ashen, his carefully constructed world beginning to collapse as he realized that his deception had been discovered by the very people he thought he was protecting, that his loyalty and silence had been purchased with promises that were never intended to be kept. The other board members began to murmur among themselves, their voices creating a low buzz of confusion and growing concern as they tried to process the implications of their CEO's unexpected disclosure. The lawyers were scribbling notes frantically now, their legal minds racing through scenarios of criminal liability and regulatory exposure that could destroy careers and send people to federal prison for decades. Marcus felt the ground shifting beneath his feet as he began to understand that he wasn't the hero of this story, just another pawn in a game that was far more complex and dangerous than he had realized when he first decided to speak up. The revelation continued to unfold like a nightmare in slow motion, each new detail adding another layer of complexity to a situation that Marcus had thought he understood but was only beginning to comprehend. Jonathan Meridian explained that the company's internal audit team had been quietly investigating environmental compliance issues for months, following paper trails and interviewing employees in an effort to identify the source of data that didn't match their regulatory filings. Caldwell had been their primary suspect, but they had needed concrete evidence and witness testimony to build a case that would stand up in court and protect the company from criminal prosecution. Marcus's intervention had provided exactly what they needed: independent verification from an outside observer who had no financial stake in the outcome and no reason to fabricate evidence for personal gain. The janitor felt sick as he realized that his moment of moral courage had been orchestrated, manipulated by people who were using his honesty and desperation as tools in their own corporate power struggle. Emma's face floated in his mind, her bright smile and trusting eyes serving as a painful reminder of how naive he had been to believe that truth and justice operated by the same rules in the world of corporate finance, as they did in the small apartment where they lived their simple, honest lives. The environmental contamination was real. The threat to thousands of families was genuine, but his role in exposing it had been carefully calculated by people who understood that sometimes the most effective weapons are those wielded by innocent hands. The Pacific Investment Group representatives were demanding answers now, their voices rising with anger and concern as they began to understand that they had been brought to Chicago under false pretenses, lured into a merger that would have destroyed their company and their reputations if Marcus hadn't interrupted the signing ceremony. Their lead negotiator, a sharp-faced woman named Catherine Holbrook, was already reaching for her phone to contact their legal team in Los Angeles, her California tan looking sickly under the fluorescent lights as she realized how close they had come to financial suicide. The merger documents that had seemed so promising just hours ago now looked like elaborate instruments of corporate warfare designed to transfer massive environmental liabilities from Meridian Financial to their unsuspecting partners on the West Coast. Jonathan Meridian watched the chaos unfold with the calm detachment of a chess master who had been planning this endgame for months, his careful positioning of pieces finally paying off in ways that would protect his company while destroying his enemies. Caldwell sat in stunned silence, his expensive suit wrinkled and sweat-stained, his career and his freedom hanging in the balance, as federal prosecutors would soon be called in to investigate charges of fraud, conspiracy, and environmental crimes that could send him to prison for the rest of his life. Marcus felt like he was watching a movie where he didn't understand the plot, his simple desire to prevent a disaster having been transformed into a weapon in battles he hadn't known were being fought by people whose motivations remained hidden beneath layers of corporate strategy and personal ambition. The boardroom had transformed into something that felt more like a crime scene than a business meeting, with evidence of deception and conspiracies scattered across the mahogany table like pieces of a puzzle that was finally beginning to reveal its complete and disturbing picture. Jonathan Meridian's assistant appeared at the door, as if summoned by some invisible signal, her presence indicating that this confrontation had been planned and orchestrated with the precision that characterized everything the CEO touched. Behind her stood two men in dark suits, who didn't look like lawyers or executives, their bearing and alertness suggesting federal law enforcement officers who had been waiting for this moment to make their dramatic entrance. Caldwell's eyes darted toward the exits, his survival instincts finally overriding his corporate training, as he realized that his comfortable life of wealth and privilege was about to end in handcuffs and newspaper headlines that would destroy not just his career, but his family's reputation for generations to come. The environmental folder slipped from his nerveless fingers and scattered across the floor. Page 47 and its damning evidence finally exposed to the light after weeks of careful concealment and desperate protection. Marcus watched in fascination and growing horror as the truth he had tried so hard to reveal became just another piece of evidence in a case that had been building long before he found the courage to speak up, his moral stand having been anticipated and incorporated into strategies that had nothing to do with justice and everything to do with corporate survival. The federal agents moved with practiced efficiency, their badges and credentials transforming the conference room into an active crime scene as they began the process of securing evidence and taking statements from witnesses who had never expected to become part of a criminal investigation. Special Agent Maria Santos, a compact woman with intelligent eyes and graying temples, took charge of the situation with quiet authority, her presence bringing a sense of order to chaos that had been spiraling out of control for the past hour. She explained that the Environmental Protection Agency and the Securities and Exchange Commission had been investigating Meridian Financial for months, following up on anonymous tips and suspicious regulatory filings that had raised red flags in multiple government agencies. Caldwell was read his rights with mechanical precision, his wrists secured behind his back with handcuffs that gleamed in the morning sunlight streaming through the conference room windows, his expensive watch catching the light one last time before disappearing behind his back. The Pacific Investment Group representatives were treated as potential victims rather than co-conspirators, their shocked expressions and obvious confusion providing clear evidence that they had been targeted for deception rather than included in the conspiracy. Jonathan Meridian cooperated fully with the investigation, his careful preparations and documented concerns about environmental compliance having positioned him as a concerned CEO who had acted responsibly when confronted with evidence of wrongdoing by a subordinate. Marcus found himself being treated as a key witness rather than a troublemaker, his 8 years of invisible service having established a credibility that money couldn't buy and power couldn't fabricate. The morning sun climbed higher in the Chicago sky as the investigation unfolded, its light revealing details and connections that had been hidden in shadow for months while Caldwell constructed his elaborate deception. Marcus answered Agent Santos's questions with the same careful precision he brought to his cleaning duties, his years of observation and his natural intelligence allowing him to provide insights and details that proved crucial to understanding the scope of the environmental fraud. The other executives were questioned individually, their stories revealing a pattern of willful ignorance and deliberate blindness to warning signs that should have prompted immediate action months earlier. The merger documents were seized as evidence, their legal language hiding crimes that could result in billions of dollars in fines and decades of prison sentences for those responsible for the conspiracy. Emma would be getting out of school in a few hours, probably excited to tell him about her day, and unaware that her father had become a central figure in one of the biggest corporate fraud cases in recent memory. The environmental contamination that had started this entire chain of events was real and dangerous, threatening communities across 3 states with toxic chemicals that would take decades to clean up and cost billions of dollars to remediate properly. But Marcus's simple desire to prevent a disaster had been transformed into something far more complex, a catalyst for investigations and prosecutions that would reshape the landscape of corporate responsibility and environmental regulation for years to come. The conference room gradually emptied as the federal agents completed their initial evidence gathering, leaving behind only the detritus of a conspiracy that had nearly succeeded in its goal of enriching the wealthy while poisoning the innocent. Marcus found himself alone with Agent Santos, who had requested a private conversation to discuss his role as a witness in the criminal proceedings that would follow. She explained that his testimony would be crucial to securing convictions against the conspirators, but that his cooperation would also make him a target for retaliation from people who had billions of dollars at stake and no scruples about protecting their interests through intimidation and violence. The Witness Protection Program was mentioned as a possibility, a chance to start over in a new city with new identities for both him and Emma, but also an acknowledgement that speaking truth to power came with consequences that could last a lifetime. Marcus thought about his daughter's dreams of studying engineering at Northwestern University, her carefully planned future that might have to be abandoned if they were forced to disappear into the federal protection system. The weight of his decision pressed against his chest like a physical force, reminding him that heroes in real life rarely got happy endings, that justice came with a price that ordinary people had to pay, while the wealthy hired lawyers and bought politicians to protect their interests. The environmental report lay scattered on the floor where Caldwell had dropped it, page 47, and its explosive revelations now part of a federal case file that would consume years of litigation and millions of dollars in legal fees. Agent Santos's final words carried both promise and warning, revealing the complex reality of fighting corruption in a system designed to protect the wealthy and powerful from the consequences of their actions. Mr. Williams, what you did today probably saved thousands of lives and prevented an environmental disaster that would have poisoned communities for generations, she said, her voice carrying genuine respect for his courage and genuine concern for his safety. But the people you've exposed have resources and connections that most of us can't even imagine, and they won't hesitate to use them to protect themselves from prosecution. The warning hung in the air like smoke from a distant fire, a reminder that victory in battles like this one was measured not just in convictions and prison sentences, but in the survival of those brave enough to speak truth to power when it mattered most. Marcus nodded his understanding, his mind already racing ahead to the conversations he would have to have with Emma, the security precautions they would need to take, the possibility that their simple life in Chicago might have to end to protect them from people who viewed witness intimidation as just another cost of doing business. The morning light streaming through the conference room windows seemed different now, harsher and more revealing, illuminating a world where doing the right thing could be the most dangerous decision a person ever made. Outside the windows, the city of Chicago continued its daily routine. Millions of people going about their lives unaware that their air and water had been protected by a janitor who chose courage over comfort, integrity over security, and the welfare of strangers over his own peace of mind. The empty boardroom felt haunted by the echoes of decisions made and consequences set in motion, the mahogany table bearing witness to a confrontation that had begun with corporate greed and ended with federal handcuffs. Marcus gathered his cleaning supplies methodically, his familiar routine providing comfort and stability in a world that had been turned upside down by his moment of moral courage. The environmental folder's scattered pages would be reassembled by forensic accountants and environmental scientists, their data used to build criminal cases and civil lawsuits that would stretch on for years. Jonathan Meridian's careful orchestration of events had protected his company while destroying his enemies, but it had also exposed Marcus to dangers that would follow him for the rest of his life. The Pacific Investment Group representatives had returned to California with their dreams of expansion shattered, but their company intact, saved from destruction by the honesty of a man they had never met and would probably never thank. Emma was waiting for him at home, her homework spread across their small kitchen table, her future suddenly as uncertain as the toxic ground that Caldwell's deception had tried to hide. The weight of what he had set in motion pressed against Marcus's shoulders as he pushed his cleaning cart toward the elevator, knowing that he had chosen a path from which there could be no turning back, a journey into a world where justice and survival walked hand in hand toward an uncertain destination that only time would reveal. 6 months later, Marcus stood in the witness box of the Federal District Court in downtown Chicago, his hand raised as he swore to tell the truth that had already cost him everything familiar and given him something far more valuable in return. The courtroom was packed with journalists, environmental activists, and family members of people who had been saved from toxic contamination by his decision to speak 3 simple words in a corporate boardroom that seemed like a lifetime ago. Emma sat in the front row, her Northwestern University acceptance letter tucked safely in her backpack, alongside the academic scholarship offers that had poured in after her story became part of the national conversation about courage and integrity in modern America. The federal prosecutor, a sharp-eyed woman named Patricia Chen, guided Marcus through testimony that had been rehearsed dozens of times but still carried the raw emotional weight of a man who had chosen truth over security when everything he loved hung in the balance. Caldwell sat at the defendant's table, his expensive suit replaced by the standard-issue clothing of someone awaiting sentencing for environmental fraud and conspiracy charges that would likely keep him in federal prison until he was an old man. The environmental contamination that had started this entire chain of events was being cleaned up at a cost of $2, $3 billion, funded by fines and penalties that had been levied against the corporations responsible for the cover-up and deception. Marcus's voice was steady as he recounted the details of his discovery, his years of invisible service having prepared him for this moment when his words would carry more weight than all the money and power that had once seemed insurmountable in their opposition to justice and environmental protection. The transformation in Marcus's life had been both subtle and profound, his status changing from invisible janitor to reluctant public figure, but his core values remaining anchored by the same love for Emma and commitment to integrity that had always defined his character. The witness protection program had been deemed unnecessary after the primary conspirators were arrested and their financial resources frozen by federal seizure orders, but the security precautions had become a permanent part of their daily routine in a world where corporate corruption bred enemies who nursed grudges for generations. His janitorial position at Meridian Financial had ended the day after his testimony, not through termination, but through his own choice to leave a building that held too many memories of the night he discovered page 47 and all the sleepless weeks that followed. The new job at Northwestern University's Environmental Science Building carried the same duties but different meaning, his work now contributing to research that would prevent future contamination disasters and protect communities from the kind of corporate deception he had helped expose. Emma's classmates treated her father like a celebrity, but she had learned to deflect attention with the same quiet dignity that Marcus had displayed throughout the federal investigation and subsequent media coverage. The scholarship offers had been overwhelming, but Northwestern's full ride remained her choice, The dream that had seemed so distant from their Southside apartment now achievable because of the publicity surrounding her father's courage and the academic excellence she had maintained despite the chaos of becoming a public figure overnight. Their new apartment near the university was larger and safer than their old home, funded by the Whistleblower Award that Marcus had received from the Environmental Protection Agency and the book deal that Emma had convinced him to sign with a publisher who specialized in stories of ordinary people doing extraordinary things. The advance payment had been modest by celebrity standards, but life-changing for a family that had lived paycheck to paycheck for most of Emma's childhood, providing financial security that allowed Marcus to focus on the environmental consulting work that had emerged from his newfound expertise in corporate fraud detection. The speaking engagements at colleges and environmental conferences had been awkward at first, Marcus's natural humility clashing with the public attention that his story continued to attract. But Emma's encouragement and the positive response from audiences had helped him understand that his experience could inspire others to find their own courage when confronted with moral choices. The death threats had decreased, but never completely stopped, a reminder that some people viewed environmental protection and corporate accountability as personal attacks on their way of life and their right to profit from other people's suffering. Agent Santos had remained a friend and occasional advisor, her respect for Marcus having deepened as she watched him handle fame and notoriety with the same grace he had shown during the most dangerous phases of the federal investigation. The witness testimony that had once seemed like a burden had become a source of pride and purpose, each court appearance serving as another step toward justice for the communities that had been targeted for poisoning by people who measured human life in terms of quarterly earnings and stock option values. The ripple effects of Marcus's decision had spread far beyond the Chicago courtroom, where Caldwell and his co-conspirators faced federal sentencing, inspiring a wave of environmental whistleblowing across the country as other employees found the courage to report contamination cover-ups and regulatory violations. Emma had started a blog documenting the legal proceedings and their family's journey from invisibility to advocacy, her writing attracting thousands of readers who found hope and inspiration in their story of transformation through moral courage. The academic scholarship offers had been accompanied by internship opportunities at environmental law firms and regulatory agencies, Emma's future now pointing toward a career in environmental justice that would extend her father's legacy into the next generation. Marcus's relationship with his extended family had been complicated by the publicity, some relatives proud of his courage, while others worried about the ongoing security risks and the way notoriety had changed their quiet family dynamic. The old neighborhood remained home in his heart, but the new apartment provided space for the security system and privacy measures that their public profile now required, a constant reminder that speaking truth to power came with permanent consequences that couldn't be undone by court victories or financial settlements. The environmental consulting business had grown beyond his expectations, corporations now seeking his expertise in identifying potential fraud and contamination issues before they became federal cases. The same skills that had once made him an effective janitor, now serving to protect communities and shareholders from the kind of deception that Caldwell had attempted to perpetrate. The courtroom proceedings had revealed the full scope of the conspiracy, with testimony from dozens of witnesses painting a picture of systematic fraud and environmental crime that stretched across multiple companies and several states. Marcus's role as the catalyst for the investigation had been acknowledged by federal prosecutors and environmental groups, but he remained focused on the practical outcomes rather than the personal recognition, his satisfaction coming from the knowledge that toxic contamination sites were being cleaned up and communities were being protected from future poisoning. Emma's acceptance speech for her academic scholarship had brought tears to his eyes, her eloquent words about integrity and courage revealing the depth of her understanding about the choices that had transformed their lives and the responsibilities that came with their new status as public figures. The financial settlements from civil lawsuits had provided additional security for their future, but Marcus had donated most of the money to environmental groups and community organizations that were working to prevent the kind of corporate crime he had helped expose. The book about their experience was nearing completion, Emma serving as co-author and providing the perspective of a teenager whose dreams had been threatened and ultimately secured by her father's decision to speak truth to power when silence would have been safer and more profitable. The writing process had been therapeutic for both of them, providing an opportunity to reflect on their journey and understand how a moment of moral clarity could reshape not just individual lives, but entire communities and legal systems. The publishers' enthusiasm for their story reflected a growing public appetite for narratives that demonstrated the power of ordinary people to challenge corruption and protect the vulnerable from exploitation and environmental crime. The evening news coverage of the trial had been extensive, with Marcus's testimony serving as the centerpiece of stories about corporate accountability and environmental protection that reached millions of viewers across the country. Emma watched the broadcasts with the same analytical intensity she brought to her academic work, her questions and observations revealing a sophisticated understanding of media coverage and public relations that would serve her well in whatever career she ultimately chose to pursue. The viewer comments and social media responses had been overwhelmingly positive, with thousands of people sharing their own stories of workplace corruption and moral dilemmas, Marcus's courage providing a template for others who faced similar choices between personal security and public welfare. The hate mail and death threats had become routine enough to be handled by the FBI's Threat Assessment Unit, but they served as constant reminders that some people viewed environmental protection as a personal attack on their right to profit from other people's suffering. The security measures had become second nature, Emma learning to vary her routes to school and Marcus installing cameras and alarm systems that would have seemed paranoid just months earlier, but now provided necessary protection against people who measured human life in terms of stock prices and quarterly earnings. The federal marshals who provided occasional protection detail had become familiar figures, their presence both reassuring and sobering as a reminder of the ongoing risks associated with challenging powerful interests that had unlimited resources and no moral constraints on their methods of retaliation. The transformation from invisible janitor to protected witness had been surreal, but Marcus had adapted with the same practical intelligence that had made him an effective employee and devoted father. As autumn arrived in Chicago, Marcus found himself reflecting on the journey that had begun with 3 whispered words in a corporate boardroom and continued through federal investigations, death threats, and ultimately a kind of peace that he had never expected to achieve in his lifetime. Emma's first semester at Northwestern was exceeding all expectations, her professors amazed by her combination of intellectual brilliance and emotional maturity that had been forged in the crucible of public controversy and family solidarity. The environmental science building where Marcus now worked buzzed with research projects designed to prevent the kind of contamination disaster he had helped expose, his presence serving as daily inspiration for students and faculty who understood that academic knowledge meant nothing without the courage to apply it when real lives hung in the balance. The speaking engagements had become more comfortable as Marcus learned to share his story with audiences who saw him as proof that ordinary people possessed extraordinary power when they chose to exercise it on behalf of strangers who would never know their names. The book manuscript was nearly complete, Emma's writing providing emotional depth and personal insight that complemented Marcus's straightforward account of events, their collaboration producing a narrative that had already attracted interest from Hollywood producers and documentary filmmakers who wanted to bring their story to even wider audiences. The financial security provided by whistleblower awards and book advances had eliminated the constant worry about money that had shadowed their lives since Sarah's death, allowing Marcus to focus on meaningful work rather than simply surviving from paycheck to paycheck in a system that seemed designed to keep working families invisible and voiceless. The transformation had been painful and dangerous, but it had also been liberating in ways that Marcus was still discovering as their new life took shape around principles of integrity and environmental protection. The federal sentencing hearing provided a sense of closure that Marcus had not expected to feel after months of testimony and legal proceedings that had consumed their lives and reshaped their understanding of justice in corporate America. Caldwell received 18 years in federal prison, his co-conspirators sentenced to terms ranging from 5 to 12 years, while the companies they had represented faced fines and penalties totaling nearly $4 billion in environmental cleanup costs and victim compensation. Emma sat beside her father as the sentences were announced, her hand finding his as they watched justice being served for crimes that would have poisoned communities and destroyed thousands of innocent lives if Marcus had chosen silence over courage when it mattered most. The environmental contamination sites were being cleaned up under federal supervision, with progress reports showing significant improvement in water quality and soil composition in areas that had been targeted for toxic dumping by corporations that viewed environmental destruction as an acceptable cost of doing business. The victims who had been unknowingly exposed to contamination before the cover-up was exposed were receiving medical monitoring and treatment funded by the settlement money, their health being protected by resources that would never have been available if the conspiracy had succeeded. The regulatory changes inspired by the case were being implemented across multiple federal agencies. New whistleblower protections and environmental monitoring systems designed to prevent future cover-ups and ensure that corporate crime was detected and prosecuted before communities could be poisoned by greed and regulatory capture. Marcus's role in preventing the disaster had been officially recognized by the EPA and several environmental groups, but his greatest satisfaction came from the knowledge that Emma's future was secure and that thousands of families would never experience the kind of toxic exposure that corporate executives had planned for their communities. The book tour that followed publication exceeded all expectations, with audiences across the country responding enthusiastically to a story that demonstrated the power of moral courage and the importance of environmental protection in an era of corporate consolidation and regulatory capture. Emma accompanied her father to many of the events, her poise and intelligence impressing journalists and readers who understood that their story represented something larger than individual heroism, a reminder that democracy depended on ordinary people willing to challenge powerful interests when fundamental values were at stake. The college lectures had been particularly meaningful, with students asking thoughtful questions about environmental justice and corporate accountability that revealed a generation's commitment to preventing the kind of systematic fraud and contamination that Marcus had helped expose. The media coverage had evolved from sensational headlines about corporate conspiracy to more thoughtful analysis of environmental policy and whistleblower protection. Marcus's story serving as a case study in business schools and law schools that were trying to teach students about the ethical responsibilities that came with professional success. The environmental consulting business had grown to include several employees and contracts with major corporations that wanted to avoid the kind of legal and financial disasters that had destroyed Caldwell's career and nearly bankrupted the companies involved in the contamination conspiracy. The death threats had decreased, but never completely disappeared, serving as permanent reminders that some people viewed environmental protection and corporate accountability as personal attacks on their way of life and their right to profit from other people's suffering. The security measures had become routine, but they had not prevented Marcus and Emma from building a new life that was richer and more meaningful than anything they had imagined possible during their years of invisible struggle in their South Side apartment. The Christmas season brought a sense of completion and renewal that Marcus had not felt since Sarah's death, their new apartment filled with friends and colleagues who had become family during the months of federal investigation and media attention that had transformed their lives. Emma's grades at Northwestern remained perfect, despite the distractions of book tours and speaking engagements, her professors amazed by her ability to balance academic excellence with the responsibilities that came with being the daughter of America's most famous environmental whistleblower. The scholarship money had covered not just tuition, but also research opportunities and internships that were preparing Emma for a career in environmental law that would extend her father's legacy into the next generation of advocates and activists. The environmental science building where Marcus worked had become a second home, his colleagues treating him not as a celebrity, but as a valued member of a community dedicated to preventing the kind of corporate crime and environmental destruction that had nearly succeeded in poisoning 3 states. The book's success had been gratifying, but more important was the flood of letters and emails from readers who had found inspiration and courage in their story. People who had decided to report workplace violations and environmental crimes because Marcus and Emma had shown them that ordinary families could survive and even thrive after challenging powerful interests. The speaking engagements continued to provide opportunities to share their message about integrity and environmental protection, but they had also become platforms for Emma to discuss her own journey from teenage anxiety to young adult activism, her voice adding generational perspective to conversations about corporate accountability and environmental justice. The transformation that had begun with 3 whispered words in a corporate boardroom had created ripple effects that were still expanding across the country, inspiring environmental protection efforts and corporate reform initiatives that would protect communities for generations to come. As the first anniversary of his testimony approached, Marcus stood once again in the Environmental Science Building at Northwestern University, but this time he was addressing a conference of corporate executives who wanted to learn from his experience and implement the kind of internal monitoring systems that could prevent environmental fraud before it required federal intervention. Emma sat in the audience, her notebook filled with observations about corporate culture and environmental responsibility that would inform the graduate research she was already planning, despite being only a freshman. The irony was not lost on either of them. The man who had once cleaned corporate offices in silence was now teaching corporate leaders about the importance of listening to employees who might have inconvenient truths to share about environmental compliance and regulatory violations. The executives in the audience looked uncomfortable, but engaged, their questions revealing a genuine desire to understand how their companies could avoid the kind of legal and financial disasters that had destroyed careers and cost billions of dollars in fines and cleanup expenses. Marcus's presentation included specific recommendations about whistleblower protection programs and environmental monitoring systems, practical advice based on his experience as both an employee who discovered fraud and a witness who helped prosecute corporate criminals. The transformation from invisible janitor to respected consultant had been surreal, but it had also been deeply satisfying as evidence that truth and integrity could triumph over wealth and power when ordinary people found the courage to speak up for what was right. Emma's questions during the discussion period revealed the depth of her understanding about environmental policy and corporate governance, her contributions to the conversation demonstrating that the next generation was prepared to continue the fight for environmental protection and corporate accountability. The standing ovation that concluded the presentation was gratifying, but more meaningful were the private conversations afterward with executives who committed to implementing the kind of internal reporting systems that could prevent future environmental disasters. The legacy of Marcus's decision extended far beyond the Chicago courtroom where justice had been served and the corporate boardrooms where lessons were being learned about environmental responsibility and employee protection. The environmental contamination sites were showing continued improvement under federal monitoring, with cleanup efforts funded by settlement money producing measurable results in water quality and soil composition that would protect communities for generations. Emma's blog had evolved into a platform for environmental advocacy and youth activism, her writing inspiring thousands of young people to pursue careers in environmental science and environmental law. The book had been translated into multiple languages and was being used in business schools and law schools around the world as a case study in corporate ethics and whistleblower protection. The speaking engagements had created a network of environmental advocates and corporate reformers who were working to prevent the kind of systematic fraud and contamination that Marcus had helped expose. The financial security provided by awards and book royalties had eliminated the economic pressures that had once forced Marcus to remain silent about corporate wrongdoing, giving him the freedom to focus on meaningful work that protected communities from environmental crime. The death threats had never completely stopped, but they had become manageable reminders of the ongoing risks associated with challenging powerful interests that viewed environmental protection as an obstacle to profit maximization. The transformation from invisible employee to protected witness to respected advocate had been painful and dangerous, but it had also been liberating in ways that Marcus was still discovering as their new life continued to evolve around principles of integrity and environmental protection. If this story has touched your heart and reminded you that ordinary people can do extraordinary things when they choose courage over comfort, please share it with someone who needs to hear that their voice matters, that their integrity has power, and that speaking truth to power, no matter how difficult or dangerous it might seem, can create ripples of change that protect innocent people and a PEN. Reserve the world we leave to our children. Marcus Williams started as an invisible janitor in a Chicago office building, but he became something far more important, a reminder that in America, democracy depends not on the wealthy and powerful, but on ordinary families willing to sacrifice their security to protect strangers they will never meet, communities they will never visit, and future generations who will breathe cleaner air and ink safer water, because someone found the courage to whisper 3 words that changed everything. The environmental disaster that Marcus prevented would have poisoned 3 states and destroyed thousands of innocent lives, but his legacy extends far beyond that single victory. It lives on in every person who finds the strength to report corporate wrongdoing,